All right. Sorry, don't know what I've done there. Conflict and negotiation. False start, but I won't re-record. This is my third take. So, when we're talking about conflict, we are talking about something rather reminiscent of what we talked about in the last video. We're talking about a situation where one party has something that is opposed by another party. And when we talk about party, we really mean, an individual, a group, a organisation, a company, or even a nation. Any kind of area where interests or values or qualities or goods are opposed or negatively impacted by another set of people. Okay, so the traditional view, of course, is conflict is bad. I mean, if I talk about conflict in an ordinary setting outside a university setting, everyone thinks, conflict's bad. But, there is the common feeling, a kind of lay concept, for example, of a couples thing, for example. If you're not arguing with your wife or husband or your partner, girlfriend, boyfriend, that looks good on the surface, but as many experienced couples know, that just beneath the surface of this peace can be trouble, and sometimes it's good to have a bit of an argument to get content out into the open. Now, that traditional view has in fact been in recent decades sort of countered by what's sometimes called the interactionist view, which is that conflict is occasionally positive and sometimes even necessary for groups in particular to perform well. And think back to when we were talking about diversity in groups. Now, we did point out at that stage that diversity tended to cause friction. Groups of men, women, people from different cultures or religions working in the one group, they tended to not be as cohesive, and they tended not to be as peaceful as some of the more groups that are more homogenous, all the same. But they also tended to produce better value decision making, for example, or greater creativity under certain circumstances. So you can see that peace is not always the best thing. And in fairness to the traditional view, studies do tend to show that conflict can reduce group cohesion. It can reduce the amount of information people are willing to share with each other. It can, alter decision making and be related to some very important bottom line issues such as stress leave, sickness leave, insurance payouts, accident rates, for example. And research tends to show, and this is another issue worth underlining, whether the figure is 42% or not, but the research does show that one of the key tasks that a manager undertakes is dealing with conflict in the workplace. Now, conflict can be, as we say, functional or dysfunctional, which is the way we'll look at it. And we'll have a look at, first of all, the functional conflict. Now, this was something that was first talked about by a social worker whose work in troubled households gave her insight to the value of diversity and also the value of some level of conflict. And she later on made the very unusual transition from being a social worker, working in family homes, into a corporate sector. Mary Parker Follett. She was one of the great pioneers of the subject that you're studying at this moment. And one of the sayings that she had was that unity rather than uniformity needs to be our aim. Uniformity sort of suggests that everyone wears the same uniform, so to speak, all the same. But unity means we're not the same, but we work together. So that's a nice summing up. Now, dysfunctional conflict can be either, related to task conflict, which is often indistinguishable from from process conflict. Both of them relate to how things need to be get done, or what things need to be done. And there's no doubt that conflict and process conflict, task conflict and process conflict do impact negatively on performance, particularly when individuals are working in environments of uncertainty. And once again, this is a bit of echo from what we talked about in the last lecture. Now, relationship conflict, however, has the largest and most clearly negative impact on performance. That's what the literature tends to consistently show. And relationship conflict is the interpersonal stuff, the human type of conflict, something that can almost never be eliminated. Task and process conflict, a good manager can see the problem, identify it, overcome it, deal with it. But relationship conflict will keep on coming up because you always have staff turnover. And dysfunctional conflict, the point that we will make about it that is consistent is that regardless of whether it's positive or negative in the end result, it always does tend to lead to lower job satisfaction. Now, a nice big clear model, the conflict process model, it's straight out of the textbook. We'll have a look at some of these issues, but sources of conflict, incompatible goals, differences between people or divisions of a company or differences in aims, interdependence, the degree to which we depend on each other. We talked about scarce resources, ambiguous rules or ambiguity in general, and poor quality communication. And then these issues then go through a process of perception and how they translate into emotions, and this is a kind of contingency. So if people don't perceive something as being incompatible or different, or perceive these problems as being a significant source of conflict, then it may not become what we call manifest conflict, where it becomes apparent and clear. And people do vary in some of these conflict styles and conflict-related decision-making, and also how they carry out conflict. Do they immediately descend to blows, or do they keep it civilized? And then we get the conflict outcomes, and they include both the positive and negative. Positive outcomes can be when you resolve issues, can improve team cohesion. It can make an organisation more responsive to the differences either in the marketplace or within the organisation. Better quality decision making, as I mentioned earlier, and the negative ones we've also talked about. All right, let's do a little bit more detail on some of those shortly. Okay, so sources of conflict. We talked about incompatible goals, differentiation. You can get issues like intergenerational, older people versus younger people. In virtual teams, there is the potential for greater conflict because people don't get a chance to face with that multi-channel communication we talked about in previous lectures to resolve issues quickly and efficiently, and that can lead to conflict. Interdependence. See if interdependence, where people are dependent on each other to achieve an outcome, but one person doesn't deliver, or one party doesn't deliver on that dependency relationship. Just a quick example, let's say you're in charge of delivering reports, but the photocopiers run out of paper, and the person in charge of purchasing is meant to do all the purchases to make sure that there's a good supply of paper and toner for the photocopy, but they don't. That's a potential for conflict because you're dependent on them. Scarce resources, it's obvious. When there isn't as much to go around, people get a little bit more brittle in their emotions and their degree to which they trust and are relaxed about things, and that can cause conflict. Ambiguity, not being sure about what the rule states, what's allowed, what's not allowed, what's an acceptable level of performance, for example, and obviously poor communication. Now, the textbook talks about these three different kinds of frame and three different kinds of ways of framing problems and conflict. Now, the interest-based frame is kind of the best, if you like, form of frame, which is why I've put it up the top here. It tends to focus on the problem and not on personalities like that relationship conflict that we talked about. When you frame a conflict in rights, it focuses on contractual, legal, or legislative, or the official view of what the boss says. And finally, power-based frame, as my boxing glove sort of suggests, focuses mainly on who's got the power and who's got the status to follow through, to push through a decision. So these two, the rights and power-based frames, when you frame a conflict in those, or frame a problem in those terms, it more often leads to conflict. Now, there are five different responses to a conflict situation, how you can problem solve in these cases. And they range from the ultimate, which is problem solving, which is that going back a business, the interest-based frame. So problem solving is what we call a highly cooperative, so it's on a high level of cooperation, and it's also assertive, motivating to satisfy one's own interests. But if you are not high in cooperation but low in cooperation and very assertive, you're basically forcing an issue. That's using, that power-based frame that we talked about. But if you are highly low in cooperativeness and low in assertiveness, you simply avoid the problem, walk away from it, which can actually be a positive way to deal with certain kinds of situations. Or yielding, you are very cooperative but very low in assertiveness. You basically, in a nice way, say, it's yours, you have it. Compromising is this middle ground where you're moderately high in cooperativeness and moderately assertive. So these are the 5 different forms of responding to conflict. Now, typically, the forcing is sort of win-lose orientation, where you think about what you're fighting over, that prize that you're fighting over as being fixed in scale. The more you get, the less I get. Whereas the problem-solving approach is a win-win orientation where you may well think that, well, look, if we think about this problem differently, we may both get what we want. We may actually expand the pie, to use the pie language. Right. Now, this problem-solving approach tends to work well when interests are not completely opposed and when there is trust between the parties and time to negotiate. On the negative side, there is a risk of sharing information with the other party in case they use it against you. Now, the trouble with forcing, of course, is that it damages relationships, and remember that you may want to deal with the other party for weeks, months, years hence. Do you want to damage that relationship? It can escalate to become quite nasty, it has high risks, and can actually create further conflict. Forcing, however, in an emergency, it works well. You can get a problem solved quickly because it's like saying, as a boss, by using power-based frame, you just simply say, this is the way it's going to be. It can be very emotionally satisfying to do that. It tends to work well when you have a deep conviction that you will be proved right in the end, and you are absolutely right. And there is some question mark over whether the other side is being fair or ethical. Under those circumstances, it can be a good thing. Avoiding doesn't tend to get things really resolved. And so even when things look on the surface like it's good and everything's calmed down, because you've avoided the problem, haven't really dealt with it in any open way, it can allow frustration and further conflict to fester. But it tends to be a good option when things are really too het up, really too emotionally charged, and you need a cooling off period, and the cost of proceeding with the conflict at this stage becomes too great. This issue of yielding, you can get a reputation for being weak, so that next time an issue of conflict comes around, it may have seemed like a good idea to yield previously, but now you're saddled with a reputation as being weak. But if the other side is extremely powerful and the issue isn't really worth fighting for, and you haven't quite worked out things for yourself, then yielding can be a positive option. And finally, compromising. It's not ideal if there was a possibility that you could go to a problem-based approach and really work out benefits for both sides, mutual gains, as we call them. But it does tend to work well when both sides have equal power. There's time pressure, because it's quite quick to do it this way, and there's somewhat lack of trust, but openness to solving the problem itself. And under these circumstances, compromising can be a good option. So, let's turn to negotiation. It's a good topic. I could spend hours talking about it, but I think I'll just give you a taste of the fabulous Monty Python, Life of Brian. think you can't hear it because I can't hear it. Just 1 second. No, we're not going to be able to do it, which is a shame. It's a shame. I'll have to move on. But it's basically it's a long joke about negotiation, and it takes two parties to negotiate and bargain at a bargaining situation. Okay, so negotiation process whereby once again, two or more parties attempt to resolve conflict by redefining the terms of their interdependence. That's the definition from the textbook. I don't particularly like it. Let's make it shorter by simply saying conflict resolution. Now, there are some individual differences in ability to be a good negotiator. Sorry, I'm just focusing on why the video wasn't working. Okay, so gender, for example, this is a really interesting one. Studies do show that there's no real gender difference in terms of style of bargaining. However, men are often perceived as being better negotiators. Now, if you think about this, that can be partly because of the stereotypes that we have about women, that they're soft and weak. So even when they're not soft and weak, or whatever, they are still perceived that way. So people think they'll yield. And remember that perceptions can sometimes become reality in this type of situation. So women, in fairness, the way women statistically are relative to the way men statistically are, and we're not talking about how they genetically are, we're talking about how they are as a result of the way they've been brought up. And remember, even as a baby, female children get treated quite differently to male children, so it's quite possible that there is no actual difference between the genders, or very, very little difference, but that difference does get amplified by the way we've been brought up. Remember the nature-nurture debate I've talked about previously. So women, on the whole, have a collectivist perspective in terms of seeing things, and even their speech styles in relation to negotiations is more similar to male individuals from high context cultures. So a female Australian might have a more similar speech style to for example, a male Filipino or a male Chinese person, where high context cultures come into play. And remember, high context cultures rely on broader knowledge of in-group codes in order to decipher messages. In low context cultures, such as Australia, the communicator has to be a lot more explicit to get a message across. Now, one of the things in relation to negotiation is that women tend to set lower targets, and they have lower expectations as a way they've been brought up. It's sad to say, but it's true. And as a result of these lower targets that they have in their head, or the lower expectations, they tend to get less in negotiations. So they do tend to become less successful as negotiators. Women also exhibit more anxiety. Simply mentioning the term negotiation to a lot of women causes anxieties. Now, in relation to culture, we talked about the high context and low context cultures. But societies high in this collectivist value, they tend to value harmony, group goals, and social capital, whereas individual societies like Australia tend to value economic capital, creating and claiming value in deal making. We'll talk about those terms in a minute. Power distance. We've talked quite regularly about power distance, but in relation to negotiation, one interesting finding, for example, is that in these hierarchical societies where there is higher levels of power distance, senior managers are often brought into negotiations as a kind of symbol. Now we're getting serious, or we've got a lot of weight on this team. And cultures like Australia, when we're having intercultural negotiations, don't often recognise this status signalling is going on. So, in terms of making a deal and reaching this calm, kitten-like state of peace that we're all aiming for, you need to set some limits. And the terms that you need to keep in mind in relation to this is target points and resistance points. Now, quite simply, target points are the best possible outcome that you're looking for, and resistance points are kind of like the worst possible outcome that you're prepared to accept, or the other person's prepared to accept. So when you're in the process of negotiation, you have to set your own personal limits, target and resistance limits, but also second guess what the other person's targets and resistance limits are. And this is a process of assessing the other person's position and assessing the power. And this issue of what point do we walk away? It's very similar. The textbook refers to this as the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And my eyes swim when I see this. I don't really know quite how that works, but it is very similar to resistance point. So I prefer to go with resistance point. Now, remember, your power increases when you have options. So as part of the process of working through this issue, you need to try and maximize your alternatives, give yourself a way out so that you're not desperate to settle. And you have to look at the other party and also assess to what degree are they hemmed into a corner? Do they have alternatives? So this process of assessing power is quite important. Now, create and claim value. I did promise I'd introduce these terms. Now, to create value is to maybe create a bigger pie, so to speak. So you problem solve and you recalibrate, rethink, reevaluate a problem. Claim, this issue is more the greedier side of negotiation, where you're thinking in fixed pie terms, making sure that you obtain the best outcome for your side. And remember, in that process, a more aggressive, less collaborative form of negotiation. Remember this issue of anchoring, which I've talked about previously, where the first person to make an offer tends to be the winner in a sense, even though people tend to think of it outside the university sector, they tend to think of making the first offer as a sign of weakness. In fact, it tends to be a sign of strength because it sets a cognitive target point in the mind of the other person and makes them negotiate in their own mind around that figure. What figure are we going to sell this car for? They're thinking their target point is 10 grand, their resistance point is 5 grand. You come up with 4 grand, and they're going to be starting to think about settling it around their resistance point as opposed to their target point, because you've started off with that kind of anchoring process. This process of creating and claiming value is, of course, a process of spying, trying to find out as much as you can about the other side. Maybe they don't value things the same way you do. And you do need to avoid, in relation to the create component, do need to try to avoid a fixed pie mindset and make sure that you can understand the other person's point of view, because you may have something in your kit that you can hand over in this negotiation process that's highly valuable to the other person. And particularly if you know that in advance, that can be helpful in the negotiations. Think about the power of delays. Now, delays can be a sign that the other side is trying to increase costs or to weigh you down, for example, in a long court case. But also, the opposite can be true. By giving a short-term ultimatum, they can be increasing the pressure on you and subsequently trying to force you into a poorer quality decision-making process. Think beyond the deal. When we talked about the timeline of these negotiations, you need to think of what we were talking about there was this issue that particularly within a company, when you're negotiating, for example, as a manager with unions or manager with employees, you've got to realise that the employees are going to stay with your company, hopefully, unless you keep on advertising jobs, very expensive, and retraining new staff. You're going to keep employees. You want to maintain that reputation. You want to maintain a relationship with your staff. The textbook talks about 6 different types of unethical tactics within the workplace, negotiation tactics that can be damaging for managers to engage in. And that includes faking emotions, which is kind of like emotional intelligence, as we talked about previously, spying, trying to work out information about the other side through illegitimate means, getting to their allies, which means, you try and find out who supports their position and undermining their supporters, delivering false promises, which is a form of lying, misrepresentation, which is also a form of lying, and ultimately being competitive. Now, that's not necessarily an unethical practice, and in fact most managers regard it as being an accepted form of behaviour within a negotiation process. Most of them think about negotiation and conflict in competitive terms, even though I've urged you to think about it more broadly than that. Study, as I show there, a study from Phillips and Cheston in 1979 shows that most executives know that this conflicting or competitive style of negotiation doesn't work that well, but nevertheless still it's such a favoured one that they still stick to it anyway. So in terms of cooling down or heating up conflict, to cool down conflict within a workplace, you can try to even up the value differences, emphasize the things you've got in common, focus on these superordinate goals, which are the big goals that you all share. So I've talked about this previously. There is something that managers and employees share. If there's an outsider attacking your organisation, then you have a common enemy and a common motivation. And you can argue with your employees, for example, that it is important that we band together and reduce costs because we've got a common enemy. That's a superordinate goal there. Of course, improving communication can be a way of reducing conflict, but remember we talked about the contact hypothesis. Spending time, meaningful time with other people, smooths out the differences between us. We realise we're all brothers and sisters underneath. However, this particular hypothesis doesn't work if the fundamental differences between you and the other party that haven't been resolved at all, then contact can actually make things worse. It's a bit like having an injury that's hasn't healed yet and you keep on picking at it. That's a good way of thinking about it. To clarify things, remember that conflict thrives on confusion. Structural change. Imagine if you've got two parties through, just in terms of personalities and not getting on with each other. A very simple way to solve that is simply separate the parties. Put one in one division, send one to Perth, send one to Auckland. Done, fixed. The problem's fixed without too much extra effort. Establish a positive climate within the organisation. And you can do that through being open, interesting, humorous, trustworthy. You can also heat up conflict. You can make it worse. Rarely a good idea. But just so that you know how this can happen, you can communicate differences, highlight differences between people, bring in outsiders. Now, this is an interesting one, or devil's advocate. This is an interesting one. Quite classically, it's often been thought that to bring in outsiders on a problem, true outsiders, can help cool it down. But what actually happens there is that parties can get into almost like a competition where they try and sell their complaint to a third party, and thus exaggerating the differences between the parties in a very public forum. So it can actually make things worse. Restructuring organisations, ambiguity, poor communication, rapid change, or reducing the amount of resources available to people, all the things that we talked about earlier. Having smaller groups. Larger groups tend to become more bland and have less conflict as a result of the simple scale of the group. So these are some of the ways you can heat things up. Now, of course, functional, good quality conflict can improve group performance and decisions, as we suggested earlier, increase creativity, increase engagement if handled well, and open up new avenues to handle future conflict resolution and create greater awareness. I mean, sometimes if you haven't had a fight about something, you didn't even know that there was a problem in the first place, and you learn something from that. And of course, conflict offers an obvious opportunity for change. On the dysfunctional side, it's pretty obvious what we've already talked about. It can reduce the degree to which people will be willing to trust and communicate with each other. It can reduce group cohesiveness and group effectiveness. And just to close, so we've got these two kinds of bargaining processes that we look at, and I've just called them distributive and integrative bargaining, which are two terms that you'll find a bit in the literature. And just quickly, in terms of the goals of the distributive approach is to try to get the maximum for yourself. For the integrative approach, which is the more softer approach, is to expand the pie rather than get as much of the pie as you can. The motive for the distributive approach is grab as much for yourself as you can, win-lose, whereas the integrative approach is try to get both sides to win. Interests are opposed under the distributive, or congruent, working together in the integrative. Information process is high sharing in the integrative and low sharing, with the low sharing and holding your cards close to chest with the distributive. And the focus is on the long-term relationships with this integrative approach, short-term relationships, whatever I can get right now with this distributive approach. And the focus of the negotiations tends to be, my position for the distributive approach, what I care about, and what do you care about? Finding that out as part of this integrative approach. Thanks very much. We're done with very few minutes over the 30, which is always good to see.